The St. Louis County grand jury came back with a no indictment. They did not indict Darren Wilson, and that set off a looting and rioting, and was not one of our finer moments. Well, out of that chaos came a bill signed by the governor in a state that can't agree on much these days, agreed wholeheartedly that they wanted to limit how much money these small communities could take from tickets. That law is being challenged right now, and the man who wrote that law joins us now for a couple of minutes. Eric Schmitt, thanks for joining us here on the Big 550 KTRS.
Good to be here.
You are a Missouri State Senator, and we should also say, in terms of full disclosure, you are running for Treasury.
I am.
Treasurer
Yep.
of the state. And you are a big supporter of Nurses for Newborns.
I am on the board, yes.
So I go easier on you because you are a supporter of Nurses for Newborns.
Thank you.
This bill, which was passed, which was signed, which is now in effect, says that, well, what does it say?
Well, as you mentioned, after everything that unfolded last year, one of the things, when the data became available and some of the coverage from national and local outlets, we became very aware that there were way too many municipalities too dependent on traffic tickets and fines. So we enacted a bill to limit that. In St. Louis County, it limits a municipality's ability to get money from traffic tickets and fines to 12.5% of their budget. And so what we found was in St. Louis County, there were municipalities getting 20, 30, 40, 50, 60% of the revenue from traffic tickets and fines, and it was leading to a breakdown of trust between people in their governments and people in their courts, because that's where people were ending up. You had this proliferation of poverty. You had debtor prisons, people literally going to jail for 2 weeks for their inability to pay a fine for a taillight being out. And so it called all of us in a bipartisan way. You had African-American clergy, ACLU, conservative Tea Party groups, law enforcement, all coming together to pass this bill. Last week, mayors from 12 municipalities, some of which were abusers of the system, quite frankly, filed a lawsuit to challenge the constitutionality of Senate Bill 5. We feel very confident, I feel very confident the law will be upheld. This is, in my view, McGraw, this is the last dying gasp of a system that hasn't worked. It's been unjust and needs to go away. And so it's sad, but not surprising that many of these municipalities, because really this isn't a lawsuit against Senate Bill 5. This is a lawsuit against the people, and I'm confident we're going to win.
So people don't understand this who don't look at the numbers, who live outside the region, when you talk to them about what happened in Ferguson, because it was a worldwide story, and you say towns with 2,000 people wrote 17,000 tickets last year. They don't comprehend that. I mean,
right.
That's unbelievable when you think about it.
Or a city like St. Anne that went from 6 years ago, when they had them all, writing about 1,000 tickets a year, to not having them all, writing 10,000 tickets a year. And so this was a revenue grab. This was about treating people like ATMs, whether it was their residents or passersby, and it was propping up a lot of these budgets. And so now, for the first time, a lot of these communities are going to have to make some decisions about governance structure, and is there a better way? Because maybe in a 3 square mile area where you have a dozen municipalities, you have a city manager, you have a mayor, you have 6 aldermen, you have a prosecutor, a judge, a city attorney, public works department. Maybe that's the best way to do it, but maybe it's not. And for the first time, I think our region, is particularly in the St. Louis area, is going to have an opportunity to review that, because if you violate this law, and I think this is what concerns some of these bureaucrats, if you violate this law now, disincorporation's automatically on the ballot, so the people are going to have a chance to decide.
Which before you had to get 2/3 of a majority to disincorporate. Now it just automatically goes on the ballot.
That's correct.
So it's much easier to disincorporate. And
it goes on the next general election ballot. So the maximum number of people can actually vote on, as opposed to putting on some goofy election in March.
Eric Schmitt with us, Missouri State Senator, who's talking about this municipal court reform law that's in effect and the lawsuit that is now in the court. It also came out recently, a town like Pagedale, Eric Schmitt, where you mentioned people go to jail for a taillight out. There are now reports of people going to jail because their curtains don't match, or their curb is too high, or their truck, their lawn isn't manicured properly. So the argument is they're going from ticketing the drivers to ticketing the people who live in these towns for money.
Yeah, and I think that is emblematic of the problem that we have, that these cities are figuring out new and innovative ways to reach into people's pockets. And it's what I've called taxation by citation. Some people call it policing for profit, whatever you want to call it. It's wrong. And these cities that are defending these practices are on the wrong side of history. We have moved forward. I mean, I will tell you, McGraw, there are people from other parts of the country asking us how we took on this challenge, because it's not really unique to Missouri or St. Louis. It's more pronounced probably here because of the 90 municipalities that we have.
Right.
But it's a problem other places. I think we can be a model for reform. This is another area where some of these cities are going, and we have a legislative session that starts in about 45 days, and I've certainly been following the news on these new ways for non-moving violations, and all options are on the table next year.
But going back to the cap of the tickets, what's interesting about following this, and watching legislation get made, as they say, is like watching sausage get made. But the argument is that it's capped at 12.5% in the city, but 20% in rural Missouri. So the argument is, hey, how come there's two different laws and two different percentages for two different towns?
Yeah, and that's the nature of their lawsuit. And the reality is we have hundreds of laws on the books that deal with challenges that are different in certain parts of the state than in other parts of the state. For example, we have a different TIF law in St. Louis County than the rest of the state. We have a pool tax law that's as complicated as any law you're going to find that's unique to St. Louis County. There are laws that are specific to particular cities in other parts of the state. So this idea that we can't have laws that address challenges in particular parts of the state than other parts of the state is ridiculous and is a loser from a legal perspective, which is why I think their lawsuit's going to get thrown out. Look, St. Louis County had 14 municipalities where traffic tickets and fines were the single biggest source of revenue. You didn't find that anywhere else. There are 30 municipalities that are over the 12.5%. You have 81 municipal courts in St. Louis County, which is 61 more than any other circuit in the whole state. We had challenges in St. Louis County that you didn't see in other parts of the state, even though there are examples of speed traps in other parts of the state as well.
Are you saying that you might be able to sort of crack down on the citation issue for his houses? I mean, is that now up? There some political will to get that done as well?
Yeah, I'm looking very closely at that. There's a lawsuit that's been filed by a libertarian group, Institute for Justice, challenging that. And I've always said, people have asked what's next. We're watching very closely what some of these cities are doing to capture revenue in ways that, quite frankly, continue to erode trust between people and the government. That is one thing that we're looking at, so stay tuned.
And Eric Schmitt, this is the 1-year anniversary of this Michael Brown decision. This lawsuit or this legislation came directly out of Ferguson.
Absolutely. It opened our eyes, I think, to broader issues, and primarily the people who are being caught up in our municipal court system that is so dysfunctional. We're primarily poor and primarily African American in the St. Louis region. And so certainly the data that came out, the attention that came out of the unrest, I think focused us in on some challenges that our region faces, and having the system of taxation by citation that ensnares a lot of folks in our region was ripe for reform. And we came together in a bipartisan way to address that.
He wants to be your next state treasurer. He's your current Missouri State Senator. Eric Schmitt, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
824 here, Big 550 KTRS in